Hey, everybody, welcome to another special episode of the Fantasy Fiends podcast. Today, we're talking my favorite subject, villains. And to talk, we've got some awesome people coming in from all over, literally all around the world. Why don't we start from all the way somewhere far, far away? Alec, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and where you're calling from?
My name is Alec Hutson. I'm from a little bit north of Boston, but currently live in Shanghai, China. I write epic fantasy, and very excited to be here. Thank you, Andy.
That's awesome. And your book is one of the two books in the Battle of the Villains challenge for the month, right? Tell us just a little bit about
it. Yes, it's a pretty standard farm boy found himself more magical than expected. But there's a villain in the story that readers tend to connect with. So my villain I'm putting forth in this battle her name is Aliana.
That's an awesome name for a villain right there. And the other half of the Battle of the Villains is Zach. Why don't you tell us about you, your books, and your villains?
Hey, I'm Zach Pike. I live up in the coast of New Hampshire, so pretty near where Alec came from. The book I'm entering is Orconomics, which is a fantasy satire. And the villain I guess I'm putting forward, which we're deciding right now, is Johann the Mighty, who is a paladin of some renown who also happens to be evil.
That's awesome. All right, and joining us, of course, we have some awesome... They're not villains themselves. Let's get that clear. I mean, well, maybe DW is masquerading as a nice guy, but he's actually a villain deep down. But everyone else is very nice, very kind, but their villains and their stories are awesome. So why don't we have them introduce themselves one at a time? Charles, take us away.
Hey, my name is C.T. Phipps, and I am the author of the Super Villainy Saga, which is the story of a man named Gary Karkovsky, aka Merciless, the supervillain without mercy, trademark. He's just not quite evil enough for his position. It's been a very successful series, and I've known some of the other authors here and enjoyed their work a great deal.
That's awesome. I've heard great things about the tournament of super villainy, so it's awesome to have you on. DW, the man in the nice man mask.
Well, I don't know if I masquerade too much as a nice guy. My villainy is pretty much on display for everybody to see. But I'm DW Hawkins. I write The Seven Signs, which is basically a story about an uber powerful magical weapon that was sundered, X numbers of years ago, and the people who are running around trying to recover it. And the villain of the story is named Maz. He's a necromancer and he eats people. So
nicely done. Nicely done. That's Villainy 101. Lesley.
I think I'm on a little bit of a delay compared to you guys, but I am Lesley. I write across different genres, and under fiction, I am Lesley Donaldson, and I hail from Toronto, Canada. And my villain is actually the protagonist of my story. I also have an antagonist villain, so I kind of double down today.
Nicely done. Nicely done. And Melinda.
Hi, I'm Melinda Spencer. I write under the pen name M.L. Spencer, and I wrote a series called the Renmore Saga. And in my series, the protagonists are kind of not so good, and the bad guys are, well, they can be kind of good. So there we go.
Yeah, that was one of the cool things about the Renmore Saga. Those of you who have watched the podcast regularly saw Melinda on like 2 weeks ago. So you remember we were talking about and how the story takes it from both sides. So both the good guys and the bad guys, the good guys and bad guys to each other. I thought that was an awesome construction.
Well thank you.
And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andy Peliquin, author of the Hero of Darkness series, where like Lesley, my good guy is the bad guy, half demon assassin, and the bad guys are the good guys. And it's just very confusing and so much fun to write because it's a fun way to flip things on their heads. And so I'm going to start off the podcast with an easy question for all of you guys, like ease you into this. Who is your favorite villain, not from your own stories, but from all fiction, all TV, movies, books, comic books? Who's your favorite villain of all time?
Everyone's thinking, I just won?
Oh, yes. Can I go first?
Go for it.
Okay, two favorite ones there. I'm going to say this is because of my Spider-Man Underoos era permanently printing itself on my brain. But I'm going with the Black Cat and Venom from Marvel Comics. Just love them both. Black Cat is the Catwoman, but the one I found first. and obviously a hero who is a villain and an anti-hero and all those in between, and that dynamic kind of environment just makes for fertile conflicts with the quote-unquote hero. And same for Venom, really. I mean, he just got his first movie.
You know, I think I liked Black Cat as a character better than Catwoman. At least in the recent years, they've developed her as a much more interesting character than DC did Catwoman. I haven't read a lot of Catwoman, so I can't tell you, but I know that Black Cat they've done really interesting in recent years.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that there. Catwoman has kind of stagnated as Batman's girlfriend, while Alicia Hardy is a character that is an antagonist to Spider-Man because they never will ever set up him permanently with her. So it's a on and off, again, on again antagonism role. And I like that. It's informed how I write all my relationships. And, well, that's why my characters are probably miserable.
Very good. All right. Who else is a favorite villain? Let's see if we can make these good.
I've got one. Hannibal Lecter.
Ooh, nice. Classic. What is it about Hannibal Lecter that makes him so interesting?
I love him because he is so smart and he is so diabolical and he has absolutely no care. He's a sociopath in every single way.
He's a sociopath, not a psychopath?
I would call him, well, that's a great question. Yeah. I don't know, Andy. I think that you are the particular expert on this. How would you classify it?
I think he's a psychopath.
Okay.
I'm not 100% certain. I'd have to look him up. I've never actually watched the Hannibal movies, which is kind of embarrassing to admit out loud. But as far as I know, he's a psychopath because of his more violent outbursts, as opposed to sociopaths. They're not as violent in their outbursts. They are, but not to the same degree as psychopaths. So.
That's true.
Who else is a favorite villain before I get into mine?
I'm going to pick an old one. John Saul, Stuff for the Children, is one of the formative books in my brain. And the villain is actually an older sister who's possessed by the spirit of a ghost. And so it was incredible as a young woman reading about a young woman villain who is basically abducting children and torturing them because the ghost is making her do it. And it was totally creepy. And yeah, so I think it just stuck with me for a long time.
No, the ghost made me do it. How many people can use that excuse?
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, everyone's going to say Darth Vader and the Joker because they're awesome, but the number one villain from fiction or from things that have stood out to me is Hans Landa from Inglourious Bastards. Anybody who's seen that opening scene of him smiling, drinking milk, and then ordering the murder of Jews. It is just the greatest opening scene of any movie that I have ever seen. Just watching him so polite, so smiling and friendly, and then just diabolical. It was amazing.
I think Hans Landa, that's a really excellent choice. I was just rewatching some Inglourious Bastards clips, and he's a hypnotic character, mesmerizing. I have to say that since we talked about we're bringing comic books into it, I think Magneto is a really compelling villain because he has arguably laudable goals, and you can empathize with what he's trying to do. It's really just the way that he's going about trying to do it that makes him a villain. But he's got a tragic backstory, and you can really empathize with him and what he's trying to achieve in his universe. So I think that's a big part of being a compelling villain for me, is be actually able to understand where they're coming from and, perhaps having some aspect of their personality that you really appreciate and like.
And I love how in especially in the last 5 or 10 years, they've done a few Magneto comics, and they've written him where you can empathize with him. He's the good guy of his own comic book series. He's not the bad guy of the X-Men. He's the character because they present the antagonist of his comic as worse. And so there's just this super fine line where he's either the good guy or the bad guy, depending on the perspective. But it's so easy to understand how he's the good guy. But it's only because, you've got the White Knight X-Men, all squeaky clean, supposedly, that make him the bad guy. But it's so because he's right on that line, it makes him so much more of an interesting character than, say, Sabretooth, who's just a straight-up killer.
Yeah, Magneto was one of my favorites as well growing up. But if we're gonna pick a favorite for this, I'm gonna have to go with the Borg, man, because the Borg is just inevitable. You know what I mean? It's like it's more like a force, and it learns from what you do, and it's almost unstoppable. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna go with the Borg, man.
That is a pretty cool type of villain. Just this unstoppable force.
Yeah, because I mean, how do you beat something like that, right? You got to figure out a way to beat it, and it's just immeasurably stronger than, you know, the good guys or whatever you want to say. Which I think that makes really a really good villain. You know.
Yeah, definitely. And Zach, you know, I think you're the last one.
Yeah, I don't know if she's really a good villain, but I've always had a soft spot for Ungoliant from Middle Earth. She's like Shelob's mother, and in all the lore, like it's all just Melkor, the Sauron's old boss, like showing her things, and then she eats it. It's like, you know, here's some trees of light, and she just eats them. Okay, well, here's a city, it just eats them. She's like Cookie Monster meets Shelob, wandering around just nomming on everything. And the way they beat her, she wanders off in the desert, and then she just eats herself. She gets so hungry, she eats herself. She's like Pizza the Hut without the intellect. It's awesome.
So basically, like doesn't she kind of represent just sort of one of the primal forces of nature, which is hunger? You know, like in the end, she's eating everything, and it's not like she's evil or good. Sort of like Galactus in the comic books. You know, he just goes throughout this, you know, the universe eating things because he's hungry.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I don't know. I was this unintentionally comic spin. I love Tolkien, but whenever I read about Ungoliant, I smile.
I like that. That's cool. So, a question for all of you guys: what makes a good villain? Like when you think about a villain that really stands in your mind, what are some of the characteristics or traits that you really like?
Well, I would like to say that the first thing I was taught whenever writing a villain is every villain is the hero of their own story. You just have to get in their headset to discover why they justify what they do and how they justify it. And sometimes they can make a really good argument, as we see with Magneto. I mean, Magneto may be a little extreme, but if the U.S. government is actually building Sentinels, yeah, I'm going to go with him over Charles.
That's interesting. You know, I actually take umbrage with that statement. Every villain is a hero in their own mind, just because it really boils everything down to the hero versus villain, good versus bad, white versus black. For me, the kind of villains that I like are not so much the ones who are evil versus good, but the ones who just want something, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get it. And so the good guys, their actions will usually be tempered by some sort of morality, whether they're willing to kill, like my assassin character, or whether they're not, like the more White Knight characters. They want something, they're going to work to get it, but there is some limit they won't cross. And it has nothing to do, in my opinion, with hero versus villain or good versus bad. It's just more like, you know, morality and ethics. Everyone has some line that they won't cross. And the villains, the more villainous villains, their line is a little bit more extreme for our current society as compared to the heroes or the protagonists, who have these lines that we can all agree, yes, those are lines that we shouldn't cross.
You could also argue that many times fiction frames things as good versus evil when they're not necessarily nearly as stark or contrasting. A lot of times in fiction, it's just their side versus yours, and just one gets arbitrarily declared the perspective, and we sympathize with them, even when, again, we have the villain who can make just as compelling argument that they are the good guys in this. And
definitely,
you can definitely see many heroes do compromise their ethics or cross that line or do that thing, but we understand them much better than the villain who has done the exact same thing. And
definitely.
This is something that I think is part of why dark fantasy has taken such a huge turn from being niche inside a niche to being closer to the mainstream than traditional fantasy, at least right now. We have Game of Thrones that was based around the idea of, let's get really into the villain, quote unquote's head, and find out what their perspective is. And, well, it often comes off as more rational in such a cynical and dark world as Westeros.
Very true.
And I'd like to say that I've read at least two of the authors here's work, and Orconomics is a funny but dark take on very realistic greed in economics. And I love Ren Wars for just being, we're going to follow these guys as the good guys, watch them do everything they can to stop the quote-unquote baddies, and then immediately switched perspectives to seeing how horrifying the monstrous actions of these magical demigods massacring thousands of innocent soldiers. And that was just classic. It's I feel jealous. I'll have to talk about how another series of mine other than the supervillainy saga called Wraith Knight, which is basically the perspective of a great giant fantasy war from a ring wraith.
Yeah, I remember talking about that on our podcast. Who was going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say I'm reading that right now, and I'm loving it.
Well, seeing as you've got the floor, why don't you tell us what makes a great villain for you?
Me?
Yes.
Pretty much the same thing that you just said. I really believe that unless there's like some type of a psychological illness going on, the difference between a villain and a hero is just the perspective. You know, a great example is, you know, in any war, you've got two sides that think that they are justified. The other side is not justified. We are morally correct. They are not. And it just depends on which side of the boundary you stand on. That's all there is to it.
Yeah. That perspective, that fine line, like literally there is no difference. I mean, you know, there are some wars where things are very clearly, not very clearly, but more clearly. Like if you take some of the actions in World War II, where you have the Nazi people doing Nazi things and you have the British doing British things, you balance that out. The Nazi things were clearly worse. Whereas you take other wars, and it was all just a matter of who was in the wrong place, who wanted what that someone else had. And yet it all kind of comes down to that. I want what you have.
That's true. But even our quote unquote justified people have committed war crimes and serious war crimes. So it just kind of depends on, you know, what you're able to let yourself do. And I don't think anybody's got their hands clean.
Yeah, definitely.
If I could bring something up, one of the funniest things I observe as a historian is the TV show Vikings, which is on the History Channel, and it's terrible history, but it's entertaining as all get out. And the thing that the show keeps running into is the fact that the Vikings are raiders and pillagers and invading these other nations just to slaughter and take what they can. And the show doesn't shy away from that, but they keep going, well, we're on their side because there's just so much cooler than these lame victims in Britain. And I'm like, you're just not dancing around that, are you?
Alec, what about you? What makes for a great villain?
You guys have covered a lot of it. I mean, I feel that, again, as I mentioned before, if you can't empathize with a villain, for me, there's only so far a villain can go if it's just like an inexorable force that swallows its enemies, whether that's the Borg or free market capitalism. But you do need to, you know, find that connection with the villain in order to you know, really appreciate where they're coming from and you know, get the depth to the conflict that you need.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree, though, that there is a certain amount of enjoyment in sort of the inevitable victor, like the bad guy, like the Borg, as an example. You want the good guys to win. So in a way, it's a great villain because it's making you root for the protagonist. Like it may not be a very three-dimensional villain. It may not be a super relatable villain, but at the same time, when the good guys win, you feel happy, you feel elated because they defeated the inevitable. And there's a certain amount of triumph in that.
Yeah, I don't know. I find that the more Tolkien-esque sort of fantasy where you have the Dark Lord and you have the pure people, you know, opposing them. That sort of story, that kind of like Manichaean view of the world doesn't really, I don't find it very compelling. For me to have for a book to really grab me, it needs to have the depth of characterization for, you know, all sides. Like in Game of Thrones. I mean, we were talking about great villains. You could bring up, you know, a half dozen from Game of Thrones. And Jaime Lannister, I think, is one of the greatest, most amazingly written villains, or whatever he is now, of modern fantasy literature, because you can clearly see his arc. You can empathize with him, but you can also realize that he's a monster. And I don't know, it's that sort of story. I think is just, it's got a lot more going for to me now as a reader than the more, you know, I don't know. I recently read a book. It was a phenomenally written book. It was a terrific book. I highly recommend it. It's called Priory of the Orange Tree. But the villain was just sort of like this stock arch evil that was returning to the world. And it just, there's so much about that book that I absolutely loved. But the actual overarching like reason for the overarching conflict in the book, it just was that was the least compelling part of the book for me.
Interesting. Zach, what about you?
I don't know. I think you know, the key to a villain isn't necessarily that they have an empathetic point. It's just that they're familiar in some way. And an empathetic point of view, or kind of a complicated reason for doing things, is one way to pull that off, and that's great. But I think on the other side, you have villains who can be really compelling, not because you can think like them or you can identify with the way they think, but because you've encountered them and because it's familiar that you've found someone like that. You know, like Umbridge, Professor Umbridge in Harry Potter. I don't think anyone's like, man, I really think like that woman. But at the same time, she's one of the most famous villains from that series because she's so obnoxious, and we've all met someone that way. You know, and I think like Tolkien, you know, in today's postmodern society, doesn't you know, Sauron isn't particularly compelling as a villain, although Ungoliant is awesome. But Sauron I get. But you know, if you had grown up with Hitler at your doorstep, I think the idea of this all-consuming, just flat-out evil that's slowly taking over the land might have seemed a lot more, wow, that's what life is like, you know. So I think it's just really that idea of have you encountered it? Can you empathize with it? Can you have some connection to it, as opposed to just a Captain America, or excuse me, a Captain Planet villain who just, you know, I want to pollute, ha ha ha, and it's a cartoon.
There's something I should note about the all-consuming or unsympathetic villain. I do believe they can be done very well, but the thing is a matter of perspective. A villain that is just pure evil or pure destruction, you know, say a zombie plague for whatever, or in some cases the Borg, it's not what the villain itself represents as sympathetic, but how they affect the protagonists. And that's something to remember when writing. You don't have to make the villain sympathetic, though I obviously tend to do that with my protagonists, where the line between good and evil is very, very thin. Other times I just want something that challenges our protagonists and forces them to make decisions that they wouldn't normally do, twisting them, in which case the protagonist is the one undergoing the character arc and maybe even being warped by encountering these things that force them to make the hard decisions or do things terrible or be tempted in ways they normally. I mean, the classic decision of do you save one person or 30? And if you save that 30 person, is that actually the right decision if they turn out to be all jerks?
Very interesting. DW, you're the only one who hasn't chimed in yet.
Well, I mean, everybody's been shitting on the Borg pretty hard, but I think, you know, all right, somebody said something earlier, you know, that you can't sympathize with a villain. I disagree there. I think you can sympathize with a villain. I think as long as you understand them, right? If you're talking from a writing perspective or from a reading perspective, you know, this changes. But from a writing perspective, you got to provide enough backstory so that the reader understands the reasons behind what the villain is doing. You know what I mean? Even if it's completely terrible, it's just nasty, whatever, and it's not something they're going to enjoy, they're not going to like this character, they can at least understand why they're doing what they're doing, right? And, you know, in the Borg's defense, you know, what they're doing is, you know, trying to assimilate everything to make itself better, you know. So internal consistency, I think, is a big part of it.
One of the things that I really like about creating villains is giving them redeemable qualities that they actually don't pay attention to, because then it makes you cry in your head, why aren't you doing it? And they seem more villainous that way. And so when they get their comeuppance, you're either cheering that, yeah, or they're the Darth Vader flip, and you have more empathy for them once they've flipped over to the good side.
I like it.
One interesting comparison from Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire is while we love Jaime Lannister, we also have characters who just exist to be hated and stomp all over our protagonists and make their lives hell. We have the Mountain, we have Walder Frey, and we have the Boltons. and they have no sympathetic qualities whatsoever, but they just really motivate our protagonists by scarring them in ways that wouldn't be possible if they were more sympathetic.
Speaking of Game of Thrones, I'm surprised nobody's talked about Joffrey. That guy is one of the most irredeemable people in the world who I just cannot relate with. I don't know if too many people can. But then again, I cannot think of a character I have loved to hate near as much as Joffrey.
Probably Dolores Umbridge would be one of the very few who people love to hate as much as Joffrey.
Oh yes, Joffrey is a great character. In the books when he's dying, they try and make us sympathize with the poor young boy who just didn't have a father. I'm like, no, let him die. He's old enough to know better. Screw it. Make a celebration.
Yeah, well, I guess what makes this discussion is what makes a compelling villain. For Game of Thrones, a character like Bolton or Joffrey, far more compelling for me than the Night King, which I could really care less about. The Lannisters and the Boltons, for me, are just much better villains. Saruman's a better villain for me than Tolkien, or than Sauron. So I don't know. The inexorable Vorse villain just. It's not really. It may loom over a story, but it's not. If that's the main villain of a story, I'm not going to find it very compelling.
That's true. That's true. That having that as one of the villains is sort of a good way to propel the story forward. But at the same time, you do need to have like there's no such thing as a faceless army. The army has the commanders, and then there's the officers, and then there's the individual soldiers. So this army of evil is going to have, the guy at the top, the Night King, but then there's also going to be his Knight commanders and then his Knight officers and all of that. So then you can have these different people who have different things that you can not relate to, but more personalized than just faceless army of evil.
Right. You need a head of marketing is what you need.
Exactly. That's awesome. Now, because this show is all about villains and because y'all are on the podcast, tell us a little bit about the villain in your book and what makes them a villain that you loved writing and that readers love, that they connected with, that made them say, this is a great villain. Anyone can go first.
Well, I'll take a stab there. One of the things I enjoyed about writing the Super Villainy saga was the villain is the main protagonist. While you may think that's cheating, I point out, obviously, the character's main enemy is himself and his own urges and desires, that once he gets the powers and lives in a comic book universe, he decides, I'm going to use this to make money and live out the good life and have all the excitement with none of the sympathy or responsibility that comes with being a superhero. And I face him against many other much worse supervillains who are farther down the path of destroying any goodness or respectability in their hearts. And it reflects on him as like, do I want to go down this road? And usually he's thinking like, yeah, I'm game.
Anyone next? I can jump in. I have a fantasy series that is a genre mashup. It is contemporary fantasy. It's historical fantasy. It feels a little bit sword and board fantasy because of magic, but it is called The Queen's Viper, and the second book in the series is The Wrath of Atticus. And Viper is my villainous heroine, and she's just so much fun to write because, like I said, she's got redeemable qualities. And sometimes she wants to have those redeemable qualities, and other times she could really care less about her redeemable qualities. And that makes it a little bit fun because as a reader or a writer, that good part of you says, go on, go answer that call to defend Queen Elizabeth against a future war. And she chooses not to. Instead, she, taunts the Queen on her boat during her Jubilee celebration instead. So I got to play with some of those disrespect of authority type of relationships, which you would never be able to do in real life, jump on the Queen's boat and essentially lick her ear. But the other part that makes her very fun to read is that she's a bit unpredictable. And I think that's good in any kind of character. You don't want them to be too predictable, but at the same time, for a villainous character, I think you need that little extra edge as your protagonist. You know they're going to follow along some kind of form of hero's journey, but it might not go the way you expect it to, and they might not react the way that you expect them to, because their internal conflict, their internal dialogue doesn't fit that stereotype of hero.
Hey, could I jump back in for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of those things that occurred to me was in my other series, which I mentioned, Wraith Knight. The protagonist is also a villainous anti-hero, but in his story, he's actually faced against what in a traditional high fantasy novel would be the quote-unquote good guys. And I had fun with that. The idea behind the story is the Dark Lord, the Sauron figure, or Saruman, has already been defeated at the start of the story, and now all the orcs and monsters and ringwraiths and undead and regular human masses are free, except that doesn't cause the quote-unquote good guys to view them any better. They want to see them gone, destroyed, subjugated, or dismantled, and that leads to its own conflicts. Because the good guys are, well, we are the good guys, you are the bad guys, that's not changing, even if you were slaves of the quote-unquote tyrant. And, you know, that simple level of perspective and quite a bit of realism that grudges don't die instantly really propels the narrative forward, because the good guys who are liberators and defenders for the Lightborn are now the bad guys, or have always been the bad guys for the Shadowkind races. And, you know, just because we have coded the light is good and the dark is bad, we normally would side with the former. But here, we're following the perspective of there's these average people that have been the designated villains of this world for 1,000 years because they've been enslaved by the bad guys.
Gotcha.
Zach, what are the what does the FOE stand for in Orconomics?
Oh, forces of evil.
Forces of evil, right. Yeah, that's actually similar to Zach's books, where the villainous races, far after the fall of the Dark Lord, have tried to integrate back into society with middling success, and sometimes end up being betrayed by the forces of light. And it was it's really great, something to play around with.
Well, tell us about your villain, Alec, and what makes him or her, it was a her, right? Aliana. What makes readers connect with them, or what makes you love writing them so much?
I think Aliana, readers tend to like her because she's highly competent and manipulative and powerful, but she's not villainous for the sake of doing evil. She has very set goals, and she's a very, very selfish person. But in her mind, she's just doing what she needs to do to survive. And so I think she's I don't know, those kind of characters I think are a lot of fun to write. I wouldn't say that readers can empathize with her easily, but I think they can perhaps come to understand her perspective and where she's coming from.
Yeah, that need to survive is probably one of the most primal driving forces behind a lot of villains. It's just like you have to adapt according to your environments. The darker the environments, the darker you have to become as you adapt. And then it's kind of hard to come back from a lot of those things. So those kind of people end up being the villains. Zach, what about you? What makes it's Johan, right?
I always say Johan. I probably shouldn't.
Johan.
He's fun, but he's challenging to write. Johan is a paladin, and so he does all these stereotypically good things, and he has a triumphant laugh, and he's always flashing his shiny teeth, and making it look like he's helping everyone. And you and all the protagonists know that he's actually a bastard, but he's always kind of flashing that really noble and gallant front, and it makes him tough to write because he's kind of like the opposite of Sauron, and he's he's a one-note character on the good side. He's always kind of putting that best light forward, except for those little moments when there's a crack of madness that shows through. So he's fun, and I think readers like to hate him, and I like that about him. But actually, the most fun I had writing a character was Datar Ermine, who is the the father of the titular son of a lich in book 2, and he makes an appearance in Orconomics. He's a major villain in book 2, and because he and his son have father-son issues and father-son fights, there's always kind of a fun dynamic to his scenes where he's having arguments with his kid, and he's just trying to get this child who he thinks is a failure to kind of step up and help him on his quest. It makes him more amusing. Also, he's dead.
Yeah, there's that. DW, what about you? Tell us about your villain and what makes them awesome.
Well, my villain, like I said, is a necromancer, and he eats people. But his story is seen through the eyes of his brother, who is sort of attached to him at the hip. They have this. I can't really reveal the exact mechanic behind it yet because I haven't finished the books yet. But they're connected to each other, and so you see their story playing out. Sort of at the end. If you want to talk chronologically, and you see the bad guy Maz doing all this crazy, terrible shit because he's trying to get this weapon to get a bunch of power so that he can do something specific, which I also can't reveal. But you see him through the eyes of his brother, who's, sort of at the end of his line. All his life he's protected him and everything, but he's slowly become this evil thing. And his brother is realizing that at this point. And, well, not realizing it, but getting tired of it and starting to resist it. So throughout their story, you see a lot of resistance and, crap going on between the brothers. And I think that's really what the readers like so much, is not so much the villain himself, but seeing him through the eyes of his brother.
Now, does he eat people to gain their power, or just because they're delicious?
To extend his own life.
All right, that's
he's basically he's not quite undead. He's mostly undead. You want to put it that way, But yeah, he beats people to extend his own life, and he also uses, I guess, quote unquote, life force in his own little magic.
Awesome.
That's pretty cool. I think one of the coolest villains that I ever wrote, that I managed to write, was the villain of the Queen of Thieves series. Now there's sort of two main villains. There's the Duke of the city, because the character's a thief. The Duke, who's law and order, is obviously going to be the bad guy. And the whole thing is that he's just this super honorable guy. And there's this one thing, this one stain on his record that he's trying to erase. And so everything that he does in relation to her, to the main character, is to erase this stain so he can once again be that honorable guy. And it was just such an interesting discovery to write as I was writing the sort of climactic clash between these two, is that it's not about her or what they're doing, but it's about him. And it was just an interesting take on this character who throughout he's just, everyone sees him as super upright, but he's trying to erase this one mistake of his past. And there's another villain. There's a traitor in the Night Guild that, causes all kinds of havoc. And his reasoning at the end is so surprising. And it was so interesting to write that it was just an amazing reveal that it's all down to wanting to make people hurt for the hurt that they caused him. And that's what it is at its core. And that's so many people do that, hurt people. So the villains in the end, they're just these almost children. They're sort of trapped in the way that they were when they were initially hurt, and they want to lash out and they want to inflict that pain on others. And so everything they do, they can mask it up with whatever they want. They can say, I'm trying to do what's best for my city. I'm trying to do what's best for my people, my friends. I'm trying to protect. But in the end, it all comes down to this thing of I'm hurt and I want to hurt others. Now, for the final question of the podcast. This is a fun one. What is the single quality for you that makes a villain unredeemable? Like when you read the villain doing something in a story, what makes you say, nope, he can't come back from that. I will not forgive the author if he tries to redeem them. He or she tries to redeem them. Anyone?
Well, I have the view that redemption is something that's very often misused in fantasy. And it's something a lot of people want to play around with the themes of, but very few people do it really right. there's many kinds of redemption. There's spiritual kinds of redemption. Darth Vader kills the Emperor. He casts off evil. He's accepted by the Force. You know, that's fine there. But, you know, if he'd lived, I don't think Darth Vader would be anywhere but the rebel equivalent of a war crimes tribunal.
And he didn't even kill the Emperor. If you've seen the new Star Wars trailer, you'd know that.
That's a theory people are going. They were going full Dark Empire. I don't necessarily believe it, but we'll go with that. But you know, and then we have Jaime Lannister, who is going through, I think we can all agree, a redemptive arc. But obviously, people hate him just about everywhere he goes because he has done real serious damage and wrongs, and people react properly to that. And maybe there is no forgiveness for that, but people will have to deal with it because you need Jaime for some of the things that need to be done.
Well, no, I don't mean the characters in the story. I mean for you, the reader.
Well, that's another thing. I mean, at some point, it depends on how characters are written, because readers can sometimes forgive people who really shouldn't be if they're cool. And sometimes, you know, there are crimes that are so disgusting that the reader can never be forgiven, especially, and, you know, we all know the subject. I mean, look at Stephen Donaldson and Lord Fowl's Bane with the Thomas Covenant. He wanted to make the character do something unforgivable, and for a lot of readers, that was where, okay, I'm done. Out. I think, as a general rule, you just have to walk a careful balance with your villains if you're going to redeem them, because they have to be true in some respect to the characters themselves. And if they do something utterly irredeemably heinous, they should be treated as having done something irredeemably heinous. That's what the word means. I mean, they may try and be better, but they have to face the consequences for what they did.
Right. So now the question originally was, what is that irredeemably heinous act for you, the reader?
Well, like I said, it's going to vary on every single character and with the reader and what their perspective is. I mean, we have people who are like,
I'm asking you about for you, Charles, not what every generic
apologize.
reader.
I misunderstood, and I've just been rambling on to steal airtime from everyone else. It's a plan that has worked very well. Generally, I don't ever forgive characters who make sexual crimes, and if a character has fascist tendencies, even if it's not anything related to real life, I go with, nope, this guy was just a scumbag, and I don't care what his rationalizations are. If he was doing the militant authoritarian group, I'm like, sorry, you're a stormtrooper, goodbye.
Interesting. Anybody else have something that you, as a reader, can't forgive?
For me, it's interfering with children. Sorry.
No, you actually, that's exactly what I was going to say. So you please first.
Great minds think alike. Yeah, I was going to say interfering with children. I mean, it's one thing to allude to, so you can, which I personally don't think I would ever want to write a situation like that. But if that kind of a villain was then seen to be as redeemed and glorified afterwards, I would have a really, really hard time with that. And I don't know if that's just because I'm a mom or I'm old. I don't know.
I think you're just a genuinely good human being who can't stand seeing, children suffer. Because I think that's something.
You know me very well.
That's hardwired into all of our DNA is to reject that, to rebel against that, and to be disgusted by it. I think cruelty to animals is another one that most readers will never be able to forgive.
I think they can forgive it in a sense of the academic logic behind someone becoming a serial killer. They start on lesser. I was going to say lesser beings, that's the wrong way to put it, but you know what I mean? Like more helpless
small creatures
and animals and children. But I specifically mean that either that sexual or psychological interference with children.
Yeah. Another one that I think no one can forgive is consistent cowardice. Like when the character goes against type and performs an act of bravery, however small, at the end of the book, there is that moment of redemption. But if it's just cowardice throughout. Like, I can't think of any character that is a coward throughout the entire book that people have said, yeah, this is a character I can be okay with, you know, redemption or something like that. Just that every time making the coward's choice, there's no coming back from that.
I actually would like to mention part of the thing I loved about the Harry Potter series was the Peter Pettigrew character was set up to be someone who had a bit of good left in him and had the potential to be redeemed, and at the end really doesn't do anything to redeem himself and dies.
Yeah.
Like hesitating 1 second as the full sum of everything that his character arc has been. And, you know, that's just more or less how it probably should have been, rather than, oh, you saved my life, I'll give it now in redemption for all the horrible things I've done. No. I will say, I don't necessarily think the coward's position isn't something that can be portrayed consistently negative. Because while we throw around the word coward very often, it can mean a lot, very different things to very different people. There could be the character who simply acknowledges, no, I'm not going to go involved in danger, but moral cowardice is also something that can be unforgivable, as we would not necessarily hold someone never going against the baddies against them if they're trying to save their life, but, you know, turning someone else over to the bad guys if they were just trying to stay out of trouble would be something much more obscene in our eyes. As we saw with Inglourious Bastards, though, many people had very different reactions to that poor French farmer who had dead to rights and was probably going to kill his family if he didn't reveal them, but he did, and because of that, he was a very base-breaking character to those who really loved the movie.
Melinda, you were going to say something a while back.
Oh, I was trying to actually kind of put it like my finger on exactly what I'm trying to say. Maybe you can help me out. But any character that kind of debases those wonderful mystical things in fantasy that kind of embody the purity and spiritual essence of the story. I think a great example would be the Ranny Hen from Thomas Covenant, to borrow, CT's use of that novel, or even like Fangor and Forest, for instance, from Tolkien. These are the embodiment of all that is good in the lands, and anybody who threatens that, I think, we just naturally despise, and there is no coming back from that.
It's kind of like litterers. You always hate people who throw their beer cans in the lake, or who sully the forest. There is something wonderful about this sense of purity, and that's a very physical manifestation, as opposed to the, like you were saying, the more metaphysical or even spiritual thing. But it comes down to that we as humans are hardwired to preserve and protect the beautiful. And so when people sully it or destroy it, there is sort of this disdain or disgust for them.
Oh, sure. I mean, look at the example of the unicorn. Same exact principle. God, the Last Unicorn. Who doesn't just cry at that movie?
Zach, what about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think redemption's kind of it comes down to like a time crunch at the end. The difference between a villain who can be redeemed and a hero with a dark past is just the amount of time that you spend on it. So I think like a lot of times these things, like consistent cowardice or selling something evil. I think if a villain had enough time, maybe they could at some point come back if the novel kept on going and kept on following that character and maybe turned them into a protagonist at some point. I think for a lot of these, they're really evil, and the villain kind of runs out of time at the end of the book, where it's like, hey, one little thing isn't going to turn you around after you've done all that. Yeah. But I think the kids thing is probably an exception to that. So if you started your book and you said, well, this guy had a dark past killing kids, I'd be like, well, I'm not going to read this book. It's just you're not.
Yeah.
And that was what I was going to say earlier about violence against or doing terrible things to children. I agree with that completely. But
I love that. I love that. But
well, I'm just going to say that that is essentially Jaime Lannister, right? He starts out by throwing a kid out a window, and by the end of Storm of Swords, I think most readers empathize somewhat with him and see him more as an anti-hero than a true villain. So maybe when we talk about issues of redemption, it just comes down to the skill of the author. as much as it does about what they're actually capable of in their darkest moment.
Yeah, and I think it again also comes back to the reader, because I'm not terribly sympathetic to Jamie Lannister at this point. Maybe I'm supposed to be, but you know, he threw a kid out a window, so I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, look at Theon Greyjoy. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt there.
No, go ahead.
Theon Greyjoy is someone who also killed 2 children in the storyline there, and I think a lot of readers treat him as someone who, no matter how horrifying the tortures he endures afterwards, isn't someone who can really ever be redeemed for these kind of elements. Jamie Lannister did what he did there, and some readers are able to overlook it, but that's partially because Bran adapted, I think. Well, and that was on his wizard's journey. If in the new incoming Game of Thrones, I imagine the Bran character will probably forgive Jamie because, you know, he's now all weird wizard kind of guy. But that can't happen for Theon, and he will remain, I think, worse than scum in the majority of characters' eyes.
Very true. All right, now we are out of time. So to close off, why don't all you awesome people tell us where we can find your books with these amazing villains? Alec, why don't you kick us off?
So my first book's title is The Crimson Queen. I don't know if I ever actually said that. And it's available through Amazon in various formats. It's a good place to start.
Website, social media?
Oh, yeah. Alec Hutson at author Alec Hutson, I think, at the whatever.com. You can just Google me if you're actually interested.
Very cool. Definitely. Charles.
The Rules of Supervillainy is the first of the Supervillainy saga, and like I suspect most of us will say, is available on Amazon.com. It's also available in audiobook format, and the entire series, in fact. You can also pick up Wraith Knight from the exact same place. Both of you, anyone who wants to join my fan club can check me out on Facebook, the CT Phipps fan club.
Very cool. DW.
Got to click that button, man. All right, I'm DW Hawkins. You can find me at dwhawkins.com. Right, The Seven Signs. The first book is Child of the Flames, and it's available on Amazon and audiobook through WF House. And that's about it, man. You can find me on Facebook messing around sometimes, pissing people off here and there.
Being the villain of the Facebooks.
Yeah.
And check out the new cover for Child of the Flames. It's quite awesome.
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
Yeah. Zach. You gotta press the button.
You gotta click the button, it turns out. Yeah, no, so my books are available wherever fine books are sold, including small, quaint New England bookshops. You can go to jzacharypike.com for more information.
Very cool. Lesley.
I have a free book, actually, where you can start the Queen's Viper for free, called Inside Voices. I don't know if you can see that. It's on Amazon and on Kobo. You can start the Queen's Viper, which was a 2016 Amazon Kindle Book Award semi-finalist. And also Wrath of Atticus is also on Kindle and Kobo. And if you want to have them in paper, you can either go to acorthes.com, which is publishing company name, or go to my website, writerlesleydonaldson.com, and say hi.
Very cool. Melinda.
Well, I'm on Amazon, and I'm exclusive to Amazon. So yeah, or you can go check out my website at mlspencerfiction.com.
Very cool. And if you're watching this, you know you can pretty much just find me right here every week. Speaking of which, we'll be back on Thursday night with Brian D. Anderson. We've got a super awesome topic that I totally can't remember offhand because it's been a long day. But thank you guys so much for watching. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Steve usually does this sign-off message, so you guys know what to do. Have a good night. See you all on Thursday. Bye.